This week we're going to look at making our web server more secure. And the first problem we have is actually a pretty significant one. So we're going to be working towards storing account information in our MongoDB database. And so the information that we store about accounts is only going to be as secure as our database is. And if you go to the database.py file here, right at the top of the database class, are the password, username, and cluster for connecting to the database. And so anybody with access to this file is going to have exactly the same level of permission as the program does. So anything the program can do, a casual user will be able to do by looking at these credentials. Now, that's even worse because this entire project repository is still stored on GitHub in a public repository. So basically, anybody with access to Git has access to these credentials. So the first thing that we want to fix is we want to move these credentials out of the project directory entirely and then load them in as we need them. Now, there's a couple of different places that people typically put this kind of information. And the first place, which is really common, is as an environment variable. So if I start a command shell and then type, for example, path, that shows me the value of the path environment variable, which is where the command shell looks for executable files when I type them on the command line. And there are a bunch of other environment variables, which you can see if you go to edit the environment variables for your account or for the system. And I'm actually on my personal account. So here's the user variables for Mark. I have a OneDrive variable, a path variable, and a couple of temp variables, and then system variables, which I have access to as well. So if I were to create a special user account whose only purpose in life was to run my application, and then I edited the user variables for that system account, then only that account and systems administrators would have access to those environment variables. Now you'll notice that there's really no way of protecting information from the system administrator's account. And also, anybody who has the ability to run the application will also have the same level of permission required to look at this information directly. So this is not secure, it's just more secure. There's either more secure or less secure. In order for the program to run and access these variables, a person who is using the same account as the program has will have the same level of access. Really, the only way to make the information more secure than that is to require the person running the program to type this information in at program startup. And then the information doesn't get stored anywhere except inside of the user's brain. But this is the kind of thing, this program, potentially the web server, you're going to want to start it up every time the system gets rebooted, and there isn't necessarily going to be somebody around who knows the credentials off the top of their head to restart the server. So security is always a compromise between being able to get the job done, basically, and keeping the information secure. So for the compromise here, we're going to move the credentials out of the file, but I'm not actually going to put them in environment variables. Main reason being that when you launch a shell that has environment variables set, any process that gets launched by this shell has access to the same environment variables as the shell does. So if you can trick an application into launching a different application or a plugin, and then the plugin can access the environment variables, then you can also get access to that yourself. So it's not a huge exploit, but it's slightly less secure than just storing the credentials in a special location that only the user account and system administrator accounts can access. And so there's two places where these are typically stored depending on whether you're on Windows or on Linux. And I'm going to go ahead and start a Python here to show you how you can access them from Python. So in Python, there's a package called OS. And OS has a built-in variable named environ, which is basically has an interface that's like a dictionary. And you have these keys for the dictionary are the names of environment variables. And then the values are the values of those environment variables. So somewhere in here is path. And then here's the value of the path environment variable that we were just looking at from the command shell. Now on Windows, there's a built-in environment variable called appdata, which refers to the appdata roaming folder for the current user account. And that's a pretty typical place to store configuration files. If you're on Linux or Windows, there's a similar one called home, which I don't have because I'm on Windows, but it would be, home would be C users mark typically. So, well, not C because it's just /users/mark or /user/mark on a Linux system depending. So I'm going to go ahead and put a config file there. And you can also treat this like a dictionary. So if I want to know app data, there's the value of app data. And I can also do app data in os.environ, which will be either true or false. So this is true if you're on Windows and false if you're on Linux. And then this is true if you're on Linux and false if you're on Windows. So you can use that to figure out where to look for the config file in sort of a platform independent way. So I'm going to go to my home folder. I could create a new account for this, which would actually be even more secure, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to go to users mark, and then by default, this app data is hidden, but you can turn it on by going to View, Options, Change Folder and Search Options. Then in this View menu, Show Hidden Files, Folders, and Drives. And I also like to uncheck Hide Extensions for known file types. And then if you don't see app data and you don't want to change that setting, you can just go up to the search bar and manually type app data. You have read access to it, you just can't see it. So if you open app data, you'll see roaming, and then here are some folders with configuration files for other applications that I have installed. So first thing I need to do is pick an app name, and I've been using Music Box even though my project folder is music videos, but I'm going to go with Music Box this time, and I might change the name of my folder or project at some point. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and make a new folder called Music Box. And then inside of Music Box, I'm going to make a new text file called musicbox.ini. And then I'm going to edit that. So the format for an INI file is a standard format, and you've probably seen it before, but basically there's a section with a name, like so. So here's going to be my database credentials. And then you have a list of key equal value pairs, like so. And so what I'm going to put here is the credentials from my database class. And I'm just going to paste those in. And then get rid of the extra spaces because it's not Python anymore. So I have username, password, and cluster. And I don't need those double quotes or single quotes. There. And then I'm just going to save that. So now I have an INI file here And then how do I access that? Well, there's a built-in package called config parser that you can use for this. So the way you import it is you actually import a class from config parser. So from config parser in all lowercase, import config parser. And that gives me the config parser class. And then I can make a config parser object like so. And then config parser has a method called read, and you pass it a file name. So C colon users mark app data, oops, roaming, and then music box, my app name, and then music box.ini. So I'm going to read that configuration file, and then this thing here, it's just a config parser object, but it has an interface that looks like a dictionary. So I can say for key in config parser, print key, comma, config parser, square bracket, key. So this one, there's a section called default, which doesn't have anything in it. And then it also has a section called database. And I can access that value by saying config parser and then the string database here. That gets me the section. And then this thing too looks like a dictionary. So it looks like a dictionary of dictionaries. So for key in config parser square bracket double quote database, print key comma config parser database key. So the database section has a key value. So I see that there's a password key with the value that, and a username key, and a cluster. So that's what I want to use. Now you'll notice that it's treating these as case insensitive. So I can say config parser database username, just like it said in the printout. But I can also do username, and that works the same. So that's how I can get access to my configuration settings. And let's go to the top here. I'm going to start by saying from config parser, import config parser. And then this URI, I want to move it into this here. So if there isn't already connection to the database, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to build that URI based on configuration settings that I get from the config file. So first thing I want to do is I want to get the path to the config file. And then that's going to depend on whether I'm on Windows or Linux. So if appdata in os.environ, and then I need to import OS for that to happen. So let's go ahead and say import OS. So if appdata in os.environ, path is going to be equal to, and then this is going to be complicated enough that I want a formatted string. So os.environment appdata. So that's the route to the roaming folder. And then inside of that, I want to have a value for app data. So we're going to go ahead and also add a variable here, a constant for app name, which is going to be music box. So now there's a class constant called app name that I'm going to use here. And then it's going to be twice. .ini. So inside of the roaming folder, there's music box and then musicbox.ini. And then elif home in os.environ. The path is going to be pretty much the same here, except that it's going to be in the home folder, and it's going to use forward slashes instead of backslashes. And then I guess if I get here, I don't know quite how I would, but if I do get here, I'm going to raise an error, an exception. Couldn't find config directory. All right, so if I get here, that means I have the path. And so I'm going to go ahead and say config parser is new config parser. And then config parser dot read path. And then we get username is config parser dot get database username, and password is database password. And then cluster is config parser.get database cluster. And then, so this is using get by default, but it would also do the same thing if I use the square brackets. So either way is fine. And then here I have username and then password and cluster. And then I actually prefer this other syntax though. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Because that's what I showed you in the command shell. Though the get method .get is probably better because you can specify default values there if it's not actually in the dictionary. But I'm stubborn. Okay, so if I've done everything right, this should work exactly the same as before. And then it doesn't like it when you have all caps as a local variable inside of a method. So I'm going to use lowercase for that. And that should be everything. So let's go ahead and run it and see if it works. And then list of all videos, and that worked. And then list of all playlists. And everything looks great.